The morning of June 9, 1944, came to the Norman countryside with the false promise of peace. Mist clung to the hedgerows like the ghosts of 1,000 battles yet to be fought, and in the pale light that filtered through the canopy of ancient oak trees, Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 82nd Airborne Division could almost forget that 3 days earlier he had jumped from a C-47 transport into the darkness over occupied France. Almost. The distant rumble of artillery from the direction of Sainte-Mère-Église reminded him that the Great Crusade was far from over, that Operation Overlord had only just begun to unfold its terrible and magnificent purpose across the blood-soaked fields of Normandy. O'Brien adjusted his grip on the M1 Garand rifle and studied the stone bridge that stretched across the Merderet River before him. It was an ancient thing, built perhaps in the time of William the Conqueror, its weathered stones having witnessed 9 centuries of Norman history. Now it would witness one more chapter, one that would determine whether the Third Reich would throw the Allied invasion back into the sea or whether the liberation of Europe would continue its inexorable march eastward toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The bridge was perhaps 30 yards long and wide enough for a single vehicle, flanked by low stone parapets that offered some protection from small arms fire but would be useless against the 88mm anti-tank guns of the Wehrmacht or the main armament of the Panzer IV tanks that intelligence reported were moving up from the south. Behind O'Brien, in the ruins of what had once been the village church of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, 19 other paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division prepared their positions with the methodical precision of men who understood that their survival depended on attention to detail. Private First Class Tommy Morrison, barely 19 years old and still bearing the soft features of the Iowa farm boy he had been 6 months earlier, checked and rechecked his ammunition, counting each clip of 30-06 cartridges with the reverence of a monk counting rosary beads. Corporal Jake Rodriguez from East Los Angeles worked silently to improve the firing position he had carved from the rubble, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he stacked stones to create better fields of fire toward the approaches to the bridge. Sergeant Bill Thompson, a veteran of the Sicily campaign and the only man in the squad older than O'Brien, methodically cleaned his Thompson submachine gun while studying the terrain through eyes that had learned to read the landscape of war like a favorite book. The mission was simple in its statement and terrifying in its implications. Hold the bridge at all costs. Prevent German armor from crossing the Merderet River and striking at the vulnerable flank of the 4th Infantry Division as it fought to expand the Utah Beach beachhead. Expect relief within 24 hours, though no one specified from which direction that relief might come or whether any of them would still be alive to see it arrive. Major Harrison of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment had delivered these orders with the grave formality of a man pronouncing a death sentence, and indeed, O'Brien reflected as he watched the mist begin to burn off the river, that was exactly what the major had done. The first indication that their long vigil was about to end came at 0800 hours when Morrison, posted as forward observer in the bell tower of the ruined church, called down in a voice pitched carefully to carry only as far as necessary. Movement to the south. Looks like a reconnaissance patrol. Maybe a dozen men. Moving through the hedgerows about 800 yards out. O'Brien felt his stomach tighten with the familiar mixture of fear and anticipation that preceded combat. After 3 days of waiting, of wondering when the Wehrmacht would discover their presence and act to eliminate them, the moment had arrived. He passed the word quietly to the other positions, watching as his men settled deeper into their fighting holes and sighted their weapons on the predetermined fields of fire. The German reconnaissance patrol that emerged from the bocage 15 minutes later moved with the professional competence that O'Brien had learned to expect from enemy forces. They were obviously veterans, probably from one of the elite divisions that the Germans had stationed in Normandy to repel the expected invasion. Their uniforms were crisp despite days of combat, their equipment maintained with Teutonic precision, and their tactical movement spoke of extensive training and hard experience. The patrol leader, a sergeant with the weathered face of a career soldier, studied the bridge through field glasses while his men took up covering positions in the hedgerows. For nearly 10 minutes, the Germans remained motionless, studying the approaches to the river crossing with the patience of professional soldiers who understood that hasty action led to unnecessary casualties. O'Brien forced himself to remain perfectly still as the German sergeant's binoculars swept across the ruins of the church where the American paratroopers lay concealed. The art of camouflage was more than simply hiding from view. It required absolute discipline, the ability to suppress the natural human instinct to move, to shift position, to scratch an itch or adjust uncomfortable equipment. One careless movement, one reflection of sunlight off a rifle barrel or brass button, and the Germans would know exactly where they were and could call down artillery fire that would end their mission before it properly began. The seconds stretched into minutes as the enemy patrol conducted their reconnaissance, and O'Brien found himself counting his own heartbeats, wondering if the sound was loud enough for the Germans to hear across the 100 yards of open ground that separated them. Finally, the German sergeant lowered his field glasses and made a hand signal to his men. The patrol began to withdraw, moving back through the hedgerows with the same professional competence they had displayed in their approach. O'Brien allowed himself to breathe normally for the first time in 20 minutes, but he knew that the reconnaissance had been successful from the German perspective. They had confirmed that the bridge was undefended, or appeared to be, and they would report this information back to their regimental command post. Within hours, German armor would be moving north toward the Merderet River crossing, and the real battle would begin. The respite lasted exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes. At 1,423 hours, Morrison's voice drifted down from the bell tower with the flat, professional calm that marked him as a natural soldier despite his youth. Heavy movement to the south. Looks like a full company of infantry with armor support. I can see at least 3 Panzer IV tanks and what looks like a half-track column. Distance approximately 1,200 yards and closing. O'Brien felt the familiar cold sensation in his chest that always preceded major combat. 20 men against a reinforced company with tank support. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving, but mathematics had never been the determining factor in warfare. Training, preparation, courage, and a measure of luck would determine the outcome of the next few hours. The German attack, when it came, unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. The Panzer IV tanks advanced in a broad line across the field south of the river, their 75mm main guns covering the infantry advance while their machine guns swept the suspected positions of any defending forces. Behind the armor, approximately 100 German infantry moved forward in tactical bounds, using the bocage terrain to provide concealment and cover as they approached the bridge. The attack was being conducted by what O'Brien recognized as elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the most elite units in the German army and a formation with a reputation for both tactical excellence and brutal ruthlessness. O'Brien waited until the lead elements of the German infantry were within 50 yards of the bridge before giving the command to open fire. The concentrated fire of 20 M1 Garand rifles and 3 Thompson submachine guns erupted from the ruins of the church with devastating effect. The first volley caught the German point squad completely in the open, cutting down 6 men in the first 3 seconds of combat. The remaining members of the advance guard dove for cover behind the stone parapets of the bridge, but their position was untenable under the accurate rifle fire of the American paratroopers. Within 2 minutes, the entire point squad had been eliminated, their bodies scattered across the ancient stones like broken dolls. The German response was immediate and professionally executed. Artillery fire began falling on the church ruins within 4 minutes of the opening of hostilities, the shells arriving with the distinctive whistle that marked them as products of the deadly accurate German artillery system. The 105mm rounds exploded among the stone walls with tremendous concussion, filling the air with deadly fragments of metal and pulverized masonry. O'Brien pressed himself against the floor of his fighting position as shrapnel whined overhead and chunks of medieval stonework rained down around him. Through the chaos of the bombardment, he could hear the deeper rumble of diesel engines as the Panzer IV tanks maneuvered to bring their main guns to bear on the American positions. The first tank round struck the church bell tower at 1,431 hours, the 75mm high-explosive shell demolishing the upper portion of the structure in a shower of stone and timber. Morrison's voice, when it came through the settling dust, was strained but steady. "Tower's gone, but I'm still operational." Moving to backup position in the nave, the young soldier from Iowa had survived the collapse of his observation post through a combination of quick reflexes and remarkable luck, but O'Brien knew that luck was a finite commodity in combat, and they had already begun to spend theirs at an alarming rate. The German infantry assault resumed at 1,445 hours, preceded by a 5-minute preparation fire from the supporting artillery and the main guns of the Panzer IV tanks. This time, the Wehrmacht troops advanced with the caution of soldiers who had learned to respect their opponents. They moved from cover to cover, using smoke grenades to obscure their movement and concentrated fire to suppress the American positions. The attack was being led by a Hauptmann whose tactical skill was evident in the way he deployed his forces, using the terrain to minimize casualties while maintaining steady pressure on the defenders. O'Brien recognized the hallmarks of a veteran officer, someone who had learned his trade in the crucible of the Eastern Front and who understood exactly how to reduce a defensive position with minimum losses to his own forces. Private Rodriguez was the first American casualty of the assault, caught by a sniper's bullet as he shifted position to engage a German machine gun team that had established itself in the hedgerow north of the bridge. The shot took him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the rubble of what had once been the church altar. O'Brien crawled to the wounded soldier through the ongoing artillery fire, his hands working automatically to apply first aid, while his mind calculated the tactical implications of losing one of his best marksmen. Rodriguez was still conscious, his breathing labored but steady, and his dark eyes held the peculiar clarity that sometimes came to men who had looked death in the face and found it less terrifying than they had expected. "How bad, Sarge?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely audible over the crash of incoming artillery. O'Brien finished bandaging the chest wound before answering, noting with professional detachment that the bullet had missed the lung by perhaps 2 inches. "You'll live to see Los Angeles again, Jake, but you're done fighting for today." He helped the wounded soldier to a more protected position behind the massive stone font that had somehow survived both the German bombardment and 4 centuries of Norman weather. Rodriguez would survive, but the loss of his rifle and his tactical expertise reduced the defensive firepower of the American position by 5%, a calculation that would become critically important as the day progressed. The second German assault wave struck the bridge at 1,502 hours, and this time the enemy had learned from their earlier mistakes. The Wehrmacht infantry approached from multiple directions simultaneously, using the stone bridge itself as cover while a flanking force attempted to cross the river upstream using rubber boats. The attack was supported by direct fire from 2 Panzer IV tanks positioned on the high ground south of the river, their 75mm guns methodically destroying the cover that the American paratroopers had constructed among the church ruins. The coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was flawless, demonstrating the tactical sophistication that had made the German army the most formidable fighting force in Europe. Sergeant Thompson's Thompson submachine gun chattered steadily as he engaged the flanking force, the .45 caliber rounds chopping through the rubber boats and their occupants with lethal efficiency. The veteran NCO had positioned himself to cover the river approach, understanding instinctively that the Germans would attempt to outflank the main defensive position. His tactical judgment proved correct as a full platoon of German infantry attempted to establish a foothold on the north bank of the Merderet River, only to be met by the concentrated fire of Thompson's weapon and the supporting rifles of Morrison and 3 other paratroopers. The attack collapsed within minutes, leaving a dozen German soldiers floating face down in the sluggish current of the Norman River. The main assault across the bridge continued for nearly an hour, the German infantry advancing yard by yard through the accurate fire of the defending Americans. The Wehrmacht soldiers demonstrated the courage and tactical skill that had carried them across Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union, but they were facing opponents who had been trained specifically to hold defensive positions against superior numbers. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division had learned their trade at Fort Benning and Fort Bragg, studying the tactics of defense in depth and the coordination of supporting fires. They had practiced these skills in the hills of North Carolina and the swamps of Louisiana, and now they applied their knowledge with deadly precision against the best infantry in the German army. By 1600 hours, the German attack had stalled 50 yards short of the American positions, the enemy infantry pinned down by accurate rifle fire and unable to advance across the killing ground that O'Brien and his men had prepared with mathematical precision. The Wehrmacht commander, recognizing that his assault had failed, ordered a withdrawal to reorganize for another attempt. The German soldiers pulled back with the same professional competence they had displayed in their advance, carrying their wounded and maintaining tactical discipline under fire. O'Brien watched them go with a mixture of relief and professional admiration. These were not the demoralized conscripts of the Volkssturm or the half-trained teenagers of the Hitler Youth. These were veteran soldiers of the Wehrmacht, and they would be back. The lull in the fighting provided an opportunity to assess casualties and redistribute ammunition. In addition to Rodriguez, 2 other Americans had been wounded during the assault, though neither seriously enough to be taken out of action. Private Morrison had sustained a fragment wound to his left arm from an artillery near miss, but he remained at his post and continued to provide accurate rifle fire. Corporal Henderson from Alabama had been grazed by a machine gun bullet that had torn his helmet from his head without breaking the skin, a reminder of how fine the line between life and death could be in combat. The ammunition situation was more serious. Each man had begun the action with 8 clips of rifle ammunition, and most had expended at least half their supply during the first German assault. At this rate of consumption, they would be reduced to bayonets and hand grenades by evening. O'Brien made the tactical decision to redistribute ammunition from the wounded Rodriguez to the men who remained in action, a calculation that would have been unthinkable in training but which represented simple military necessity under combat conditions. War had its own mathematics, brutal and unforgiving, and every bullet would be needed for the attacks that were certain to come. The German commander was undoubtedly calling for reinforcements and additional artillery support, understanding that the small force holding the bridge represented a significant tactical obstacle to his division's advance. The next assault would be larger and better coordinated, and the Americans would need every advantage they could create. The expected German artillery preparation began at 1,645 hours and continued for 25 minutes, the most intense bombardment the American paratroopers had yet experienced. The 105 mm shells fell in a carefully planned pattern designed to destroy the defensive positions and demoralize the survivors, each round exploding with tremendous concussion among the ancient stones of the church. Mixed with the high explosive rounds were airburst shells that detonated 20 feet above the ground, spraying the area with deadly steel fragments that could penetrate helmets and body armor. The bombardment was being directed by a forward observer who had obviously studied the American positions with care, as many of the rounds fell with devastating accuracy among the ruins where the paratroopers sheltered. During the height of the artillery fire, O'Brien found himself pressed against the stone floor of his fighting position, listening to the whistle and crash of incoming rounds while calculating the tactical implications of what he was experiencing. This level of artillery support indicated that the Germans had committed significant resources to the reduction of his position, which meant that the bridge was more important to enemy plans than he had originally understood. Perhaps it was part of a larger counterattack designed to split the American forces and drive them back to the beaches. Perhaps it was simply a matter of professional pride for a Wehrmacht commander who refused to allow a handful of American paratroopers to delay his advance. In either case, O'Brien knew that he and his men had achieved their primary mission. They had held the bridge for more than 6 hours, disrupting German plans and buying time for the 4th Infantry Division to consolidate its positions on Utah Beach. The artillery fire lifted at 1,710 hours, and the second major German assault began immediately. This time, the enemy had committed a full battalion of infantry supported by 5 Panzer IV tanks and 2 companies of combat engineers equipped with demolition charges and flamethrowers. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, with the main effort directed at the bridge itself while supporting attacks struck the flanks of the American position. The coordination was flawless, demonstrating the tactical expertise of the German staff system and the professional competence of the Wehrmacht field commanders. O'Brien recognized immediately that this assault was qualitatively different from the earlier attacks, that the enemy had committed sufficient resources to overwhelm his small force through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The lead Panzer IV tank reached the south end of the bridge at 1,712 hours, its 75 mm main gun firing directly into the church ruins from a range of less than 100 yards. The high explosive rounds smashed through the ancient masonry like massive sledgehammers, pulverizing stone that had stood for centuries and filling the air with deadly fragments. The tank's machine guns swept the American positions with methodical precision, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down while German infantry advanced across the bridge behind the armor. The tactical situation had shifted decisively in favor of the attackers, and O'Brien knew that conventional defensive tactics would no longer suffice. Private Morrison solved the problem with the direct action that characterized American infantry tactics. The young soldier from Iowa emerged from the ruins carrying 2 anti-tank grenades and a bazooka rocket launcher that had been salvaged from a destroyed weapon position. Moving with the fluid grace of natural athlete, Morrison sprinted across the open ground between the church and the bridge while German machine gun fire kicked up spurts of dust around his feet. He reached the stone parapet just as the lead Panzer IV was crossing the center span of the bridge, the perfect position for a close-range shot at the tank's vulnerable side armor. The bazooka round struck the Panzer IV just behind the driver's compartment, penetrating the thin side armor and detonating among the ammunition stored in the hull. The tank exploded with tremendous violence, its turrets separating from the chassis and crashing into the river, while burning fuel and ammunition scattered across the bridge. The destruction of the lead tank effectively blocked the bridge to further armored attack, but the German infantry continued their assault with undiminished intensity. Wehrmacht soldiers fought their way across the burning wreckage of the Panzer IV, their uniforms smoldering from the heat of the blazing fuel, while they maintained tactical formation and fire discipline. These were troops of the highest quality, veterans who had learned their trade in the crucible of the Eastern Front and who would not be deterred by casualties or obstacles. They advanced with the methodical precision of a machine, each squad covering the movement of the next while maintaining steady pressure on the American positions. Sergeant Thompson's position was overrun at 1,724 hours, the veteran NCO falling back to a secondary line of defense after expending his last magazine in close-quarters combat with a German assault squad. The enemy soldiers who captured his original fighting position were members of an SS assault unit, recognizable by their camouflage uniforms and the lightning bolt insignia on their helmets. They moved with the fluid coordination of elite troops, establishing fields of fire and calling for supporting artillery with the professional competence that characterized the best units in the German army. Thompson had managed to eliminate 4 of the attackers before being forced to withdraw, but the loss of his position created a dangerous gap in the American defensive line. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as German infantry established footholds in the church ruins, forcing the American paratroopers back into an increasingly compressed defensive perimeter. The Wehrmacht soldiers advanced with grenades and submachine guns, clearing each room of the ruined building with the methodical efficiency of urban warfare specialists. The fighting became intensely personal, conducted at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, with the outcome often determined by individual courage and split-second reactions rather than tactical planning or supporting fires. O'Brien found himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a German sergeant who had attempted to outflank his position, the 2 men grappling among the rubble while their respective units continued the larger battle around them. The German sergeant was a veteran of the Eastern Front, his uniform decorated with the ribbons and badges that marked him as a survivor of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. He fought with the desperate intensity of a man who understood that the war was turning against his country and that every battle might be his last. His hands were strong from years of military service, and his tactical knowledge was evident in the way he used the terrain and the rubble to his advantage. The combat lasted perhaps 30 seconds, ending when O'Brien managed to bring his combat knife to bear against his opponent's throat, but those 30 seconds felt like an eternity of violent struggle in which the outcome of the larger battle seemed to hang in the balance. By 1745 hours, the American defensive perimeter had been compressed to less than 50 yards in diameter, with the surviving paratroopers holding a handful of rooms in the most defensible portion of the church ruins. German infantry occupied positions within hand grenade range of the American lines, and Wehrmacht snipers had established themselves in the surrounding hedgerows where they could engage any defender who exposed himself for more than a few seconds. The tactical situation had become desperate, but O'Brien noted with professional detachment that his men continued to fight with the disciplined competence that had been drilled into them during months of training. They conserved ammunition, chose their targets carefully, and maintained tactical communication despite the chaos and violence that surrounded them. The arrival of German combat engineers at 1,750 hours marked the beginning of the final phase of the battle. The engineers were specialists in reducing fortified positions, equipped with shaped charges and flamethrowers designed to eliminate defenders from prepared positions. They worked with methodical precision, placing demolition charges against the walls of the church while their supporting infantry provided covering fire. O'Brien recognized immediately that his position had become untenable, that the shaped charges would bring down the remaining walls and expose his men to direct fire from the supporting German forces. The mathematics of the situation were simple and unforgiving. The Americans had held the bridge for more than 8 hours, far longer than anyone had expected, but their mission was about to end in defeat and probable death. The sound that changed everything came from the north at 1,753 hours, the distinctive rumble of American armor moving through the bocage terrain at maximum speed. Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division appeared through the hedgerows like avenging angels, their 75mm guns already engaging the German positions around the church while their machine guns swept the approaches to the bridge. The leading tank, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, had covered 12 miles of Norman countryside in less than 40 minutes, responding to a radio call for assistance that had been transmitted by Morrison from his position in the church ruins. The relief force consisted of an entire tank company supported by mechanized infantry, sufficient combat power to reverse the tactical situation and drive the German forces back across the Merderet River. The German response to the arrival of American armor was immediate and professionally executed. The Wehrmacht commander ordered an immediate withdrawal, understanding that his infantry and light armor were no match for a full company of Sherman tanks operating in open terrain. The German forces pulled back across the bridge with the same tactical discipline they had displayed throughout the engagement, maintaining formation and fire discipline while their rear guard conducted a fighting withdrawal that delayed the American advance. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had been fought to a standstill by 20 American paratroopers, a tactical defeat that would have strategic implications for the German defense of Normandy. The cost of victory became apparent as O'Brien conducted a casualty assessment in the immediate aftermath of the fighting. 7 of his men had been killed during the final German assault, including Corporal Henderson, whose luck had finally run out when a German sniper's bullet found its mark. Private Morrison had sustained additional wounds during the close-quarters fighting but remained conscious and coherent, his Iowa farm boy's constitution proving equal to the demands of modern warfare. Sergeant Thompson had been wounded twice but continued to function as a tactical leader, directing the defense of the final perimeter with the calm competence that had made him invaluable throughout the engagement. The surviving members of the squad bore the 1,000-yard stare that marked veteran infantry, the peculiar expression of men who had looked death in the face and found themselves still breathing when the shooting stopped. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's assessment of the tactical situation was delivered with the crisp professionalism that characterized American armor officers. "You held them for 8.5 hours against a reinforced battalion with tank support. That's approximately 4 times longer than we estimated when we planned this operation." The colonel paused to survey the battlefield, noting the destroyed German armor on the bridge and the scattered equipment that marked the positions where the Wehrmacht assault had been repelled. "Division estimates that you delayed the German counterattack by at least 12 hours, which gave us time to consolidate our positions and bring up additional armor. From a strategic perspective, you may have saved the entire Utah Beach operation." The strategic implications of the action became clearer over the following days as intelligence reports revealed the scope of the German plan that had been disrupted. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had been part of a larger counterattack designed to split the American forces and drive a wedge between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, potentially isolating the 4th Infantry Division and forcing a withdrawal to the original beachhead. The delay caused by the defense of the Merderet River crossing had allowed American reserves to move into position, creating a defensive line that the Germans were unable to penetrate. The tactical success of 20 paratroopers holding a single bridge had contributed to the strategic success of Operation Overlord, the great crusade that would ultimately lead to the liberation of Western Europe. O'Brien found himself thinking about the mathematics of warfare as he supervised the burial of his dead soldiers in the cemetery of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, the same ancient churchyard where Norman peasants had been laid to rest for more than 1,000 years. 7 American soldiers had died to hold a bridge for 8.5 hours. But their sacrifice had contributed to a victory that would ultimately save thousands of lives and shorten the war by months or perhaps years. The calculus was brutal and precise, the kind of equation that could only be balanced in blood and measured in the currency of human courage. Each grave represented not only a life cut short but also a mathematical component in the larger equation of liberation, a tactical variable in the strategic calculation that would determine the fate of nations. The medals and commendations that followed were recorded in the official records of the 82nd Airborne Division, bronze and silver tokens that attempted to quantify courage and sacrifice in terms that bureaucrats could understand. O'Brien received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership under fire, while Morrison was awarded the Silver Star for his destruction of the German tank. Sergeant Thompson was posthumously promoted to Master Sergeant and awarded the Silver Star, recognition that came too late to matter to the veteran NCO but which provided some measure of comfort to his widow in Memphis. The medals were important to the families and to the official history, but they could not capture the essential truth of what had happened on the bridge at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer during those 8.5 hours when 20 American soldiers had held back the tide of Nazi Germany. The strategic impact of the action extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Normandy. The successful defense of the Merderet River crossing became a case study at the Command and General Staff College, analyzed by future generations of military officers as an example of how small unit actions could have disproportionate effects on larger operations. The principles demonstrated during the engagement: careful preparation of defensive positions, conservation of ammunition, coordination between supporting arms, and above all the courage to stand and fight against overwhelming odds, became part of the tactical doctrine that would guide American forces through the remainder of World War II and beyond. The human cost of these strategic victories was measured in the personal letters that O'Brien wrote to the families of his fallen soldiers, attempting to find words that could somehow explain why their sons and husbands had died on a Norman bridge that most Americans could not find on a map. Each letter was a meditation on sacrifice and purpose, an attempt to communicate the meaning of individual death within the context of historical necessity. Private Henderson's parents in Alabama would never fully understand why their son had to die to hold a bridge in France, but O'Brien tried to help them comprehend that their loss had contributed to something larger than themselves, something that would benefit generations yet unborn. The tactical lessons learned during the engagement were incorporated into the training programs at Fort Benning and Fort Bragg, ensuring that future paratroopers would benefit from the experience purchased with blood on the banks of the Merderet River. The importance of combined arms coordination, the value of prepared positions, and the necessity of maintaining fire discipline under extreme pressure became fundamental elements of airborne doctrine. The sacrifice of 7 American soldiers had generated knowledge that would save dozens of lives in future operations, another component in the brutal mathematics of warfare where wisdom was purchased with blood and experience was measured in casualties. Years later, when historians attempted to analyze the factors that contributed to the success of Operation Overlord, they would note that the Great Crusade had succeeded not because of any single decisive battle, but because of hundreds of small actions like the defense of the bridge at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. Each tactical engagement had contributed to the strategic outcome, creating a cumulative effect that had overwhelmed the German defenses and established the second front that Churchill and Roosevelt had promised Stalin. The names of the men who had died holding the bridge would be carved in granite at the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, their sacrifice commemorated for future generations who would never fully understand the price that had been paid for their freedom. The bridge itself survived the war and the decades that followed, its ancient stones bearing new scars from German artillery and American tank fire but continuing to carry traffic across the Merderet River as it had for centuries. A small plaque was installed in 1954 to commemorate the action, its bronze surface quickly weathered by Norman rains but its message enduring for anyone who cared to stop and read about 20 American paratroopers who had held a bridge for 8.5 hours against impossible odds. The plaque did not mention the strategic importance of their sacrifice or the tactical innovations they had demonstrated. It simply stated the essential facts: their names, their unit, and the date they had chosen to stand and fight when retreat would have been safer and surrender more logical. O'Brien returned to the bridge in 1964, 20 years after the action, accompanied by Morrison and Thompson, the only other survivors of the original 20. The 3 men stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in his own memories of that terrible and magnificent day when they had discovered what they were truly capable of when everything depended on their courage and competence. The Norman countryside was peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, the fields green with crops that had been planted and harvested by farmers who had never known the terror of artillery fire or the intimate horror of close-quarters combat. It was difficult to believe that this quiet landscape had once echoed with the crash of tank guns and the screams of dying men. The mathematical precision of their sacrifice had become clear with the passage of time. 7 dead American soldiers in exchange for 12 hours of delay in the German counterattack. 20 men holding a bridge against a reinforced battalion for 8.5 hours. These numbers had seemed abstract and meaningless during the chaos of combat, but they had acquired profound significance in the context of the larger victory that followed. The tactical success at the bridge had contributed to the strategic triumph of Operation Overlord, which had led to the liberation of Western Europe and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. The chain of causation was as precise as a mathematical equation, each component necessary for the final result. The legacy of the action would extend far beyond the immediate participants and their families. The tactical principles demonstrated during the engagement would influence military doctrine for decades, while the strategic lessons would inform national policy decisions long after the last veteran had passed away. The courage displayed by 20 American paratroopers on a Norman bridge would become part of the national mythology, a story told to future generations as an example of what ordinary men could accomplish when they were fighting for something larger than themselves. The bridge at Sainte-Laurent-sur-Mer had become more than a tactical objective or a strategic asset. It had become a symbol of American determination and sacrifice, a monument to the proposition that freedom was worth whatever price had to be paid to preserve it. In the end, O'Brien reflected as he stood beside the river where 7 of his men had died. The true measurement of their sacrifice could not be expressed in mathematical terms or captured in official histories. The value of what they had accomplished could only be understood by the millions of people who had lived in freedom because 20 American soldiers had chosen to hold a bridge when every rational calculation suggested they should withdraw. Their legacy was written not in bronze plaques or granite monuments, but in the lives of children who had grown up without knowing the terror of occupation, in the existence of nations that had been liberated from tyranny, and in the continuation of democratic ideals that had been preserved through the application of American courage on a Norman bridge during the early morning hours of June 9, 1944. The mathematics of warfare were precise and unforgiving, but they could not account for the human variables that ultimately determined the outcome of battles and campaigns. Courage could not be quantified, determination could not be measured, and sacrifice could not be reduced to statistical analysis. The 20 men who had held the bridge at Sainte-Laurent-sur-Mer had demonstrated that the most important factors in warfare were not material or technological, but spiritual and moral. They had proven that free men fighting for the survival of their democratic ideals could overcome any odds, defeat any enemy, and accomplish any mission when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just enough to demand their ultimate sacrifice.